In the early 1950s, the world's two most populous nations maintained a public front of cooperation. But just over a decade later, they were fighting a brutal, high-altitude border war. How did India and China end up on a collision course? To understand the war, we have to start with the optimism that preceded it. Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru envisioned an integrated Asia, built on the diplomatic slogan, Hindi-Chini Bhai-Bhai, which translates to, Indians and Chinese are brothers. For centuries, the vast Tibetan plateau acted as a physical buffer zone, keeping the borders of India and China completely separate. That geography vanished in 1950. The Chinese Liberation Army entered Tibet, erasing the historical buffer overnight, leaving India with a live, militarized northern border. India's diplomatic dream of Pan-Asian friendship was incompatible with China's post-revolution drive to consolidate its territory. The tension finally snapped in March 1959, when a massive revolt erupted against Chinese rule in Lhasa, the capital of Tibet. The Chinese military suppressed the uprising with overwhelming force. Facing capture, the 14th Dalai Lama, Tibet's spiritual leader, undertook a harrowing escape on foot across the freezing, treacherous passes of the Himalayas. He crossed into India, where Prime Minister Nehru made a fateful decision. He granted the young leader political asylum and allowed him to establish a Tibetan government in exile right there within India's borders. Beijing was furious. Chinese leadership viewed the Tibetan uprising as a strictly internal matter, and they saw India's decision to harbor the Dalai Lama as a direct act of interference. The asylum decision destroyed the final remnants of trust. In Beijing's eyes, India had become a direct threat to its internal security. The border dispute centered on two specific zones, Aksai Chin in the west and the McMahon Line in the east. In the western sector, India made a shocking discovery. China secretly built a military highway straight through Indian-claimed Aksai Chin, connecting Xinjiang directly to Tibet. The two sides tried to talk it out in April 1960, but the negotiations entirely collapsed. Neither government was willing to barter territory, swap claims, or accept any compromise. With diplomacy deadlocked, the dispute moved beyond map rooms. Both nations began a physical race to militarily occupy the high ground. Facing intense domestic pressure to do something, the Indian government rolled out a highly aggressive military strategy in late 1961. They called it the forward policy. Here is how the strategy worked. India began sending small, lightly armed groups of soldiers deep into disputed territory. They built symbolic forward posts, intentionally sliding into the gaps around and even behind Chinese positions to cut off their supply lines. This entire strategy rested on one massive assumption. Indian leadership, specifically the Civilian Intelligence Bureau, firmly believed China was bluffing. They thought Beijing was distracted by its own internal economic crises and would never risk a violent retaliation against Indian pressure. India was playing a massive game of geopolitical chicken, repeatedly provoking a heavily militarized neighbor. But they lacked the troops, modern weapons, and logistical support to back up their position. The spark that finally ignited the war came in June 1962, when Indian forces established the Dola post in the eastern sector. Look closely. The military placed this post north of the official McMahon Line, physically advancing into territory Beijing undeniably controlled. The escalation was immediate. Following furious Chinese protests, their troops descended from the high ridges surrounding the isolated Indian post. By physically crossing the map-marked boundary to execute the forward policy, India handed China an unambiguous justification to mobilize its army for a forceful response. Instead of de-escalating the standoff at Dola, Prime Minister Nehru reached a point of no return on October 12th. He publicly issued a fatal ultimatum, ordering the Indian army to free our country and evict the Chinese forces. But a massive global distraction was occurring at this exact moment. October 1962 was the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, an event that brought the United States and the Soviet Union to the absolute brink of nuclear war. Chinese Chairman Mao Zedong saw an opening. Beijing realized that with both global superpowers entirely consumed by the crisis in the Caribbean, neither Washington nor Moscow would intervene to protect India. On October 20th, 1962, China abandoned all diplomacy. They launched a massive, pre-planned, two-front invasion that instantly shattered the hollow Indian defenses. India's forward policy and Nehru's public ultimatum provided the specific trigger for the invasion. China used the global paralysis of the Cuban Missile Crisis to launch a strike while the world's superpowers were looking elsewhere.